Wind, Sand, and Stars. Chapter 7. Men of the Desert. Part 1. These, then, were some of the treasures that passed us by, when, for weeks and months and years, we, pilots of the Sahara Line, were prisoners of the sands, navigating from one stockade to the next, with never an excursion outside the zone of silence. Oases like these did not prosper in the desert. These memories it dismissed as belonging to the domain of legend. No doubt there did gleam in distant places scattered round the world, places to which we should return once our work was done. There did gleam lighted windows. No doubt, somewhere there did sit young girls among their white lemurs or their books, patiently compounding souls as rich in delight as secret gardens. No doubt there did exist such creatures, waxing in beauty. But solitude cultivates a strange mood. I know that mood. 3 years of the desert taught it to me. Something in one's heart takes fright. Not at the thought of growing old, not at feeling one's youth used up in this mineral universe, but at the thought that far away the whole world is aging. The trees have brought forth their fruit, the grain has ripened in the fields, the women have bloomed in their loveliness. But the season is advancing, and one must make haste. But the season is advancing, and still one cannot leave. But the season is advancing, and other men will glean the harvest. Many a night have I savored this taste of the irreparable, wandering in a circle round the fort, or prison, under the burden of the trade winds. Sometimes, worn out by a day of flight, drenched in the humidity of the tropical climate, I have felt my heart beat in me, like the wheels of an express train. And suddenly, more immediately than when flying, I have felt myself on a journey through time. Time was running through my fingers like the fine sand of the dunes. The poundings of my heart were bearing me onward towards an unknown future. Ah, those fevers at night after a day of work in the silence. We seemed to ourselves to be burning up, like flares set out in the solitude. And yet we knew joys we could not possibly have known elsewhere. I shall never be able to express clearly whence comes this pleasure men take from aridity, but always and everywhere I have seen men attach themselves more stubbornly to barren lands than to any other. Men will die for a calcined, leafless, stony mountain. The nomads will defend to the death their great store of sand as if it were a treasure of gold dust. And we, my comrades and I, we too have loved the desert to the point of feeling that it was there we had lived the best years of our lives. I shall describe for you our stations. Port Etienne, Villeneuve, Cape Juby were some of their names, and shall narrate for you a few of our days. I succumbed to the desert as soon as I saw it, and I saw it almost as soon as I had won my wings. As early as the year 1926, I was transferred out of Europe to the Dakar-Juby Division, where the Sahara meets the Atlantic, and where, only recently, the Arabs had murdered 2 of our pilots, Irable and Gour. In those days, our planes frequently fell apart in mid-air, and because of this, the African divisions were always flown by 2 ships, one without the males trailing and convoying the other, prepared to take over the sacks in the event the male plane broke down. Under orders, I flew an empty ship down to Agadir. From Agadir, I was flown to Dakar as a passenger, and it was on that flight that the vast sandy void and the mystery with which my imagination could not but endow it first thrilled me. But the heat was so intense that despite my excitement I dozed off soon after we left Port Etienne. Rigel, who was flying me down, moved out to sea a couple of miles in order to get away from the sizzling surface of sand. I woke up, saw in the distance the thin white line of the coast, and said to myself fearfully that if anything went wrong we should surely drown. Then I dozed off again. I was startled out of my sleep by a crash, A sudden silence, and then the voice of Rigel saying, "Damn! There goes a connecting rod." As I half rose out of my seat to send a regretful look at that white coastline, now more precious than ever, he shouted to me angrily to stay as I was. I knew Rigel had been wrong to go out to sea. I had been on the point of mentioning it, and now I felt a complete and savage satisfaction in our predicament. This, I said to myself, will teach him a lesson. But this gratifying sense of superiority could obviously not last very long. Rigel sent the plane earthward, in a long diagonal line that brought us within 60 feet of the sand, an altitude at which there was no question of picking out a landing place. We lost both wheels against one sand dune, a wing against another, and crashed with a sudden jerk into a fjord. "You hurt?" Rigel called out. "Not a bit," I said. "That's what I call piloting a ship," he boasted cheerfully. I, who was busy on all fours extricating myself from what had once been a ship, was in no mood to feed his pride. "Guillaume will be along in a minute to pick us up," he added. Guillaume was flying our convoy, and very shortly we saw him come down on a stretch of smooth sand a few hundred yards away. He asked if we were all right, was told no damage had been done, and then proposed briskly that we give him a hand with the sacks. The mail transferred out of the wrecked plane. They explained to me that in this soft sand it would not be possible to lift Guillaume's plane clear if I was in it. They would hop to the next outpost, drop the mail there, and come back for me. Now, this was my first day in Africa. I was so ignorant that I could not tell a zone of danger from a zone of safety. I mean by that a zone where the tribes had submitted peacefully to European rule from a zone where the tribes were still in rebellion. The region in which we had landed happened to be considered safe, but I did not know that. "You've got a gun, of course," Rigel said. I had no gun, and said so. "My dear chap, you'll have to have a gun," he said, and very kindly he gave me his. "And you'll want these extra clips of cartridges," he went on. "Just bear in mind that you shoot at anything and everything you see." They had started to walk across the other plane, when Guillaume, as if driven by his conscience, came back and handed me his cartridge clips too, and with this they took off. I was alone. They knew, though I did not, that I could have sat on one of these dunes for half a year without running the least danger. What they were doing was to implant in the imagination of a recruit a proper feeling of solitude and danger and respect with regard to their desert. What I was really feeling, however, was an immense pride. Sitting on the dune, I laid out beside me my gun and my 5 cartridge clips. For the first time since I was born, it seemed to me that my life was my own, and that I was responsible for it. Bear in mind that only 2 nights before I had been dining in a restaurant in Toulouse. I walked to the top of a sandhill, and looked round the horizon like a captain on his bridge. This sea of sand bowled me over. Unquestionably it was filled with mystery and with danger. The silence that reigned over it was not the silence of emptiness, but of plotting, of imminent enterprise. I sat still and stared into space. The end of the day was near. Something half revealed yet wholly unknown had bewitched me. The love of the Sahara, like love itself, is born of a face perceived and never really seen. Ever after this first sight of your new love, an indefinable bond is established between you and the veneer of gold on the sand in the late sun. Guillaume's perfect landing broke the charm of my musings. "Anything turn up?" he wanted to know. I had seen my first gazelle. Silently it had come into view. I felt that the sands had shown me the gazelle in confidence, so I said nothing about it. "You weren't frightened?" I said no, and thought, gazelles are not frightened. The mails had been dropped at an outpost as isolated as an island in the Pacific. There, waiting for us, stood a colonial army sergeant. With a squad of 15 black troops, he stood guard on the threshold of the immense expanse. Every 6 months a caravan came up out of the desert and left him supplies. Again and again, he took our hands and looked into our eyes, ready to weep at the sight of us. By God, I'm glad to see you. You don't know what it means to me to see you. Only twice a year he saw a French face, and that was when, at the head of the Camel Corps, either the captain or the lieutenant came out of the inner desert. We had to inspect his little fort, built it with my own hands, and swing his doors appreciatively, as solid as they make 'em, and drink a glass of wine with him. Another glass, please. You don't know how glad I am to have some wine to offer you. Why, last time the captain came round, I didn't have any for the captain. Think of that. I couldn't clink glasses with the captain and wish him luck. I was ashamed of myself. I asked to be relieved. I did. Clink glasses, call out, "Here's luck," to a man running with sweat who has just jumped down from the back of a camel. Wait 6 months for this great moment. Polish up your equipment. Scour the post from cellar to attic. Go up on the roof day after day and scan the horizon for that dust cloud that serves as the envelope in which will be delivered to your door the Attar Camel Corps. And after all this, to have no wine in the house. To be unable to clink glasses. To see oneself dishonored. I keep waiting for the captain to come back, like the sergeant said. Where is he, sergeant? And the sergeant, waving his arm in an arc that took in the whole horizon, said, Nobody knows. Captain is everywhere at once. We spent the night on the roof of the outpost, talking about the stars. There was nothing else in sight. All the stars were present, all accounted for, the way you see them from a plane, but fixed. When the night is very fine, and you are at the stick of your ship, you half forget yourself, and bit by bit the plane begins to tilt on the left. Pretty soon, while you still imagine yourself in plumb, you see the lights of a village under your right wing. There are no villages in the desert. A fishing fleet in mid-ocean, then. There are no fishing fleets in mid-Sahara. What? Of course. You smile at the way your mind has wandered, and you bring the ship back to plumb again. The village slips into place. You have hooked that particular constellation back in the panoply out of which it had fallen. Village? Yes. Village of stars. The sergeant had a word to say about them. I know the stars, he said. Steer by that star yonder, and you may make Tunis. Are you from Tunis? No. My cousin, she is. A long silence, but the sergeant could not keep anything back. I'm going to Tunis one of these days. Not, I said to myself, by making a beeline for that star and tramping across the desert. That is, not unless, in the course of some raid, a dried-up well should turn the sergeant over to the poetry of delirium. If that happened, star, cousin, and Tunis would melt into one, and the sergeant would certainly be off on that inspired tramp which the ignorant would think of as torture. He went on. I asked the captain for leave to go to Tunis, seeing my cousin is there and all. He said, What did the captain say, sergeant? He said, World's full of cousins, said, Dakar's nearer, and sent me there. Pretty girl, your cousin. In Tunis? You bet. Blonde she is. No, I mean at Dakar. Sergeant, we could have hugged you for the wistful, disappointed voice in which you answered, She was a nigger. Port-Etienne is situated on the edge of one of the unsubdued regions of the Sahara. It is not a town. There is a stockade, a hangar, and a wooden quarters for the French crews. The desert all round is so unrelieved that despite its feeble military strength, Port-Etienne is practically invincible. To attack it means crossing such a belt of sand and flaming heat that the Ratchas, as the bands of armed marauders are called, must arrive exhausted and waterless. And yet, in the memory of man there has always been, somewhere in the north, a Ratcha marching on Port-Etienne. Each time that the army captain who served as commandant of the fort came to drink a cup of tea with us, he would show us its route on the map, the way a man might tell the legend of a beautiful princess. But the Racha never arrived. Like a river, it was each time dried up by the sands, and we called it the Phantom Racha. The cartridges and hand grenades that the government passed out to us nightly would sleep peacefully in their boxes at the foot of our beds. Our surest protection was our poverty, our single enemy, silence. Night and day, Lucas, who was chief of the airport, would wind his gramophone, and Ravel's bolero, flung up here so far out of the path of light, would speak to us in a half-lost language, provoking an aimless melancholy which curiously resembled first. One evening we had dined at the fort, and the commandant had shown off his garden to us. Someone had sent him from France, 3,000 miles away, a few boxes of real soil, and out of this soil grew 3 green leaves, which we caressed as if they had been jewels. The commandant would say of them, "This is my park." And when there arose one of those sandstorms that shriveled everything up, he would move the park down into the cellar. Our quarters stood about a mile from the fort, and after dinner we walked home in the moonlight. Under the moon the sands were rosy. We were conscious of our destitution, but the sands were rosy. A sentry called out, and the pathos of our world was re-established. The whole of the Sahara lay in fear of our shadows, and called for the password, for Aracha was on the march. All the voices of the desert resounded in that sentry's challenge. No longer was the desert an empty prison. A Moorish caravan had magnetized the night. We might believe ourselves secure, and yet illness, accident, Racha, how many dangers were afoot. Man inhabits the earth, a target for secret marksmen. The Senegalese sentry was there like a prophet of old, to remind us of our destiny. We gave the word, "Français," and passed before the Black Angel. Once in quarters, we breathed more freely. With what nobility that threat had endowed us. Oh, distant it still was, and so little urgent, deadened by so much sand, but yet the world was no longer the same. Once again this desert had become a sumptuous thing. Aracha, that was somewhere on the march, yet never arrived, was the source of its glory. It was now 11 at night. Lucas came back from the wireless and told me that the plane from Dakar would be in at midnight. All well on board. By 10 minutes past midnight, the mails would be transferred to my ship, and I should take off for the north. I shaved carefully in a cracked mirror. From time to time, a Turkish towel hanging at my throat, I went to the door and looked at the naked sand. The night was fine, but the wind was dropping. I went back again to the mirror. I was thoughtful. A wind that has been running for months and then drops sometimes fouls the entire sky. I got into my harness, snapped my emergency lamps to my belt along with my altimeter and my pencils. I went over to Neri, who was to be my radio operator on this flight. He was shaving too. I said, "Everything all right?" For the moment, everything was all right, but I heard something sizzling. It was a dragonfly knocking against a lamp. Why it was, I cannot say, but I felt a twinge in my heart. I went out of doors and looked round. The air was pure. A cliff on the edge of the aerodrome stood in profile against the sky as if it were daylight. Over the desert reigned a vast silence as of a house in order, but here there were a green butterfly and 2 dragonflies knocking against my lamp. And again I felt a dull ache, which might as easily have been joy as fear, but came up from the depths of me so vague that it could scarcely be said to be there. Someone was calling to me from great distance. Was it instinct? Once again I went out. The wind had died down completely. The air was still cool. But I had received a warning. I guessed, I believed, I could guess what I was expecting. Was I right? Neither the sky nor the sand had made the least sign to me, but 2 dragonflies and a moth had spoken. I climbed a dune and sat down face to the east. If I was right, the thing would not be long coming. What were they after here, those dragonflies? Hundreds of miles from their oasis inland. Wreckage thrown up on the strand bears witness to a storm at sea. Even so did these insects declare to me that a sandstorm was on the way, a storm out of the east that had blown them out of their oasis. Solemnly, for it was fraught with danger, the east wind rose. Already its foam had touched me. I was the extreme edge, lapped by the wave. 50 feet behind me, no sail would have flapped. Its flame wrapped me round once, only once, in a caress that seemed dead. But I knew in the seconds that followed that the Sahara was catching its breath and would soon send forth a second sigh, and that before 3 minutes had passed the air sock out of our hangar would be whipped into action, and that before 10 minutes had gone by the sand would fill the air. We should shortly be taking off in this conflagration, in this return of the flames from the desert. But that was not what excited me. What filled me with barbaric joy was that I had understood a murmured monosyllable of this secret language, had sniffed the air and known war was coming. Like one of those primitive men to whom the future is revealed in such faint ruttlings, it was that I had been able to read the anger of the desert in the beating wings of a dragonfly. We were not always in the air, and our idle hours were spent taming the Moors. They would come out of their forbidden regions, those regions we crossed in our flights, and where they would shoot at us the whole length of our crossing, would venture to the stockade in the hope of buying loaves of sugar, cotton, cloth, tea, and then would sink back again into their mystery. Whenever they turned up, we would try to tame a few of them, in order to establish little nuclei of friendship in the desert. Thus, if we were forced down among them, there would be at any rate a few who might be persuaded to sell us into slavery, rather than massacre us. Now and then an influential chief came up, and him, with the approval of the line, we would load into the plane and carry off to see something of the world. The aim was to soften their pride, for repositories of the truth, defenders of Allah, the only God, it was more in contempt than in hatred that he and his kind murdered their prisoners. When they met us in the region of Chubby or Cisneros, they never troubled to shout abuse at us. They would merely turn away and spit, and this not by way of personal insult, but out of sincere disgust at having crossed the path of a Christian. Their pride was born of the illusion of their power. Allah renders a believer invincible. Many a time a chief has said to me, pointing to his army of 300 rifles, "Lucky it is for France that she lies more than 100 days' march from here." And so we would take them up for a little spin. 3 of them even visited France in our plains. I happened to be present when they returned. I met them when they landed, went with them to their tents, and waited in infinite curiosity to hear their first words. They were of the same race as those who, having once been flown by me to the Senegal, had burst into tears at the sight of trees. What a revelation Europe must have been for them, and yet their first replies astonished me by their coolness. Paris, very big. Everything was very big. Paris, the Trocadero, the automobiles. What, with everyone in Paris asking if the Louvre was not very big, they had gradually learned that this was the answer that flattered us. And with a sort of vague contempt, as if pacifying a lot of children, they would grant that the Louvre was very big. These Moors took very little trouble to dissemble the freezing indifference they felt for the Eiffel Tower, the steamships, and the locomotives. They were ready to agree once and for always that we knew how to build things out of iron. We also knew how to fling a bridge from one continent to another. The plain fact was that they did not know enough to admire our technical progress. The wireless astonished them less than the telephone, since the mystery of the telephone resided in the very fact of the wire. It took a little time for me to understand that my questions were on the wrong track. For what they thought admirable was not the locomotive, but the tree. When you think of it, a tree does possess a perfection that a locomotive cannot know. And then I remembered the Moors who had wept at the sight of trees. Yes, France was in some sense admirable, but it was not because of those stupid things made of iron. They had seen pastures in France in which all the camels of Air Reguibat could have grazed. There were forests in France. The French had cows filled with milk. And of course my 3 Moors were amazed by the incredible customs of the people. In Paris, they said, you walk through a crowd of 5,000 people, you stare at them, and nobody carries a rifle. But there were better things in France than this inconceivable friendliness between men. There was the circus, for example. French women, they said, can jump standing from one galloping horse to another. Thereupon they would stop and reflect. You take one more from each tribe, they went on. You take him to the circus, and never more will the tribes of Air Reguibat make war on the French. I remember my chiefs sitting among the crowding tribesmen in the opening of their tents, savoring the pleasure of reciting this new series of Arabian Nights, extolling the music halls in which naked women dance on carpets of flowers. Here were men who had never seen a tree, a river, a rose, who knew only through the Koran of the existence of gardens where streams run, which is their name for paradise. In their desert, paradise and its beautiful captives could be won only by bitter death from an infidel's rifle shot, after 30 years of a miserable existence. But God had tricked them, since from the Frenchmen to whom he grants these treasures he exacts payment, neither by thirst nor by death. And it was upon this that the chiefs now mused. This was why, gazing out at the Sahara, surrounding their tents, at that desert with its barren promise of such thin pleasures, they let themselves go in murmured confidences. You know, the God of the French, he is more generous to the French than the God of the Moors is to the Moors. Memories that moved them too deeply rose to stop their speech. Some weeks earlier, they had been taken up into the French Alps. Here in Africa, they were still dreaming of what they saw. Their guide had led them to a tremendous waterfall, a sort of braided column roaring over the rocks. He had said to them, "Taste this." It was sweet water. Water. How many days were they wont to march in the desert to reach the nearest well? And when they had arrived, how long they had to dig before there bubbled a muddy liquid mixed with camel's urine. Water. At Cape Juby, at Cisneros, at Port-Etienne, the Moorish children did not beg for coins. With empty tins in their hands, they begged for water. "Give me little water, give. If you are a good lad, water. A thing worth its weight in gold. A thing the least drop of which drew from the sand the green sparkle of a blade of grass. When rain has fallen anywhere, a great exodus animates the Sahara. The tribes ride towards that grass that will have sprung up 200 miles away. And this water, this miserly water of which not a drop had fallen at Port-Etienne in 10 years, roared in the Savoie with the power of a cataclysm, as if from some burst cistern the reserves of the world were pouring forth. "Come, let us leave," their guide had said, but they would not stir. Leave us here a little longer. They had stood in silence. Mute, solemn, they had stood gazing at the unfolding of a ceremonial mystery. That which came roaring out of the belly of the mountain was life itself, was the life-blood of man. The flow of a single second would have resuscitated whole caravans that, mad with thirst, had pressed on into the eternity of salt lakes and mirages. Here God was manifesting himself. It would not do to turn one's back on him. God had opened the locks and was displaying his puissance. The three Moors had stood motionless. That is all there is to see, their guide had said. Come, we must wait. Wait for what? The end. They were awaiting the moment when God would grow weary of his madness. They knew him to be quick to repent, knew he was miserly. But that water has been running for 1,000 years, and this was why, at Port-Etienne, they did not too strongly stress the matter of the waterfall. There were certain miracles about which it was better to be silent. Better, indeed, not to think too much about them, for in that case one would cease to understand anything at all, unless one was to doubt the existence of God. You see, the God of the Frenchmen. But I knew them well, my barbarians. There they sat, perplexed in their faith, disconcerted, and henceforth quite ready to acknowledge French overlordship. They were dreaming of being victualled in barley by the French administration, and assured of their security by our Saharan regiments. There was no question but that they would, by their submission, be materially better off. But all three were of the blood of El Mamoun. I had known El Mamoun when he was our vassal, loaded with official honors for services rendered, enriched by the French government, and respected by the tribes. He seemed to lack for nothing that belonged to the state of an Arab prince. And yet, one night, without a sign of warning, he had massacred all the French officers in his train, had seized camels and rifles, and had fled to rejoin the refractory tribes in the interior. Treason is the name given to these sudden uprisings, these flights at once heroic and despairing of a chieftain henceforth proscribed in the desert, this brief glory that will go out like a rocket against the low wall of European carbines. This sudden madness is properly a subject for amazement. And yet, the story of El Mamoun was that of many other Arab chiefs. He grew old. Growing old, one begins to ponder. Pondering thus, El Mamoun discovered one night that he had betrayed the God of Islam, and had sullied his hand by sealing in the hand of the Christians a pact in which he had been stripped of everything. Indeed, what were barley and peace to him? A warrior disgraced and become a shepherd. He remembered a time when he had inhabited a Sahara where each fold in the sands was rich with hidden mysteries, where forward in the night the tip of the encampment was studded with sentries, where the news that spread concerning the movements of the enemy made all hearts beat faster round the night fires. He remembered a taste of the high seas which, once savoured by man, is never forgotten. And because of his pact he was condemned to wander without glory through a region pacified and voided of all prestige. Then truly, and for the first time, the Sahara became a desert. It is possible that he was fond of the officers he murdered, but love of Allah takes precedence. Good night, El Mamoun. God guard thee. The officers rolled themselves up in their blankets, and stretched out upon the sand as on a raft, face to the stars. High overhead all the heavens were wheeling slowly, a whole sky marking the hour. There was the moon, bending towards the sands, and the Frenchman, lured by her tranquillity into oblivion, fell asleep. A few minutes more, and only the stars gleamed. And then, in order that the corrupted tribes be regenerated into their past splendor, in order that there begin again those flights without which the sands would have no radiance. It was enough that these Christians, drowned in their slumber, sent forth a feeble wail. Still, a few seconds more, and from the irreparable will come forth an empire, and the handsome sleeping lieutenants were massacred.